Hello students, this is your instructional video about the assessment bias assignment for the classroom assessment course here at Daytona State College. For this assignment, students often get confused because they get a little tripped up on the issue of bias and making sure they hit all components of this. So I'm hoping this video clarifies this, explains it for you. Remember, when we talk about bias, there's two basic types of bias that we really discuss in this class. The first is discrimination bias, and this can be anything that discriminates toward a group of people, whether it's racial bias or gender bias or language bias. Um, any types of those biases would be that first one, and that's discrimination. They're all listed right here. You can see them in this particular paragraph, where we're looking at, bias that is impacting one group of people with a common characteristic differently than it is for the whole population. So when you look down here at the explanation of this assignment, this is that first type of bias. It's discrimination bias. So you're looking through your materials, especially your assessment items, and you're trying to determine, is there anything that would discriminate against a specific type of people group? And oftentimes our materials today are pretty sensitive to bias, and you don't end up finding a lot of examples. So you may, which would be great, you can write about that now that you have this found knowledge. But you may come up with what we call the absence of bias, and you're going to have to write about the fact that you reviewed some materials and there is an absence of discrimination bias, and it's perfectly fine. I just need to make sure you understand what bias is. So if you can't find it, explain what you were looking for and the fact that it wasn't there, and that will cover that discrimination bias. So there's a second type of bias, and that is this issue of validity and reliability. Now this one is a little trickier and it takes some thinking. It's probably more common, and it's not going to be as obvious, but what you're looking for here is a mismatch between what the standard is, what's being taught, what should be being taught, and what is being assessed. So if the two don't match well, if there's some kind of expectation that the students have background knowledge, or they have some kind of ability to read at a certain level in order to accomplish this task, if there's some type of bias that makes your assessment not valid and not reliable, then that's what you're going to write about in the second issue here, the second area, or second paragraph really, for bias. So you need to address both. And if you cannot find any bias on either one of these, you have to talk about an absence of bias for both of them, but you've got to discuss both. And the other thing is that people get a little tripped up on is this here. It's bold and it's underlined. Folks still miss it. You must examine a variety of classroom materials. You cannot only look at one thing. So I really want you to look on things that have to do with assessment. But you can look at curriculum materials. You can look really, you want to look at things that kids have to, read and look at pictures perhaps, or graphs. You can look through textbooks or pre-made assessments. You can look through DIAs. Getting a piece of paper, a worksheet that has kids, solving, adding and subtracting fractions, and there's no words on the page other than the directions, is not going to help you with this assignment. You need something that has some meat and some content. So you've got to have at least 3 sources. That is down here. Make sure you cover that. Make sure you can clearly explain bias to me, and both types, discrimination and the validity and reliability portion. So keep in mind that one of the really important things about this particular assignment is that I can understand that you understand this issue of ESE and ELL accommodations, and to make sure that when you're looking at assignments and assessments for your students, there's no bias that's found in the materials that would be biased particularly against ESE and ELL students. So if you can just explain what bias is and whether you have an example or not, which again is an explanation of absence of bias, that will ensure that I know that you understand that bias can happen and that a good teacher is always on the lookout to make sure that bias is not being used in any of the materials, whether it's teaching or assessing materials for your classroom. So again, I'm looking for just good writing mechanics, make sure things are spell checked. Use that APA template. You should be able to, by this point, put together a reference page that is correctly formatted. Remember, author's last name first, and make sure they're in alphabetical order. You can use a citation website in order to create your citations for that reference page. Make sure it's accurate in terms of italicized, periods, parentheses, those kind of things, so that you should have, again, at least 3 assessments that you have or pieces of material that you have reviewed, and then anything else you might have reviewed should all be in your reference list. So I certainly hope this helps, and as always, I can take questions via phone, text, email, or in person in class. Best of luck.